The left-wing lunatics are trying very hard to bring back COVID lockdowns and mandates with all of their sudden fear-mongering about the new variants that are coming. Gee whiz, you know what else is coming? An election. They want to restart the COVID hysteria so they can justify more lockdowns, more censorship, more illegal drop boxes, more mail-in ballots, and trillions of dollars in payoffs to their political allies heading into the 2024 election. Does that sound familiar? These are bad people. These are sick people we're dealing with.
That was former President Trump in an ad released by his presidential campaign. He went on to warn the, quote, COVID tyrants that they will not comply. The release of the ad comes just days after President Joe Biden said the White House would request additional money from Congress to fund the next round of COVID-19 vaccines. On Tuesday, White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre said, "We know that vaccinations are the safest protection against the illness."
There'll be an updated vaccine mid-September, I believe. So we know that, as you all know, vaccinations against COVID-19 remains the safest protection for avoiding hospitalization, long-term health outcomes, and death, which is why we are going to be encouraging Americans to stay up to date on their vaccines.
Meanwhile, MSNBC host Mehdi Hasan spent a segment of his show talking about the COVID school closures and an, quote, inevitable future pandemic. Let's listen to that.
Because the myths about children and COVID, that kids aren't really harmed by it, that school closures were a massive and avoidable mistake, that they cause learning loss and mental health issues, those myths, and they are myths, dangerous myths, have endured for so long, become so ingrained, so pervasive, that they're not just something Fox viewers believe. I'm sure many of you watching at home have sadly come to accept many of these myths as true. So we need to reassert what the actual truth of the matter is, especially if we are to be prepared for the next pandemic when it inevitably comes, and especially if we are to protect and not abandon our kids right now as they return to school.
The Center for Disease Control and Prevention reports that 26 states across the country have seen a, quote, substantial increase in people being hospitalized with COVID.
So I guess we'll start with Mehdi Hasan and circle back. I watched some of this big segment he did on how school closures are great, and I guess we should do them again. And I just don't know how one squares that attitude with that it was very important and we had to do it to save people's lives, and we should have done it more, frankly, because a lot of people still did die. With the just reality, I mean, we heard from an expert on what Sweden did differently yesterday, and it's not just Sweden. It's like virtually all European countries had fewer school shutdowns than our blue states. That's true of France. It's true of Norway. It's true of, I mean, I haven't looked at literally every single country in Europe, but broadly speaking, they did try to keep, they kept schools open more than our blue states. So I don't know how, and we had abominable COVID results. But you can't say we didn't do some of the mandates and the lockdowns hard enough when peer countries did them less so and had better results.
If you were to steelman Mehdi Hasan's argument, I suspect it wouldn't sound like lockdowns, school closures were great and we should do them again. So what did he actually argue in the segment? He
argued that it was necessary to prevent he argued that a lot of children died, and we should have done more of them to prevent those deaths of children. Obviously, some children did die of COVID. The age skew of COVID means that older people are by far, like, exponentially more at risk. It is true that I think deaths among children from COVID in the U.S. were in the hundreds, not thousands, but hundreds, which is very sad because children don't often die. So it's definitely very bad. Don't get me wrong. I'm not going lightly on it, but whatever's going on there, what is the underlying bad health? I mean, I'm sure you would say it has to do with our healthcare system being bad and the funding of the healthcare system, healthcare not being of access to people. But it's hard for me, even though Mehdi Hasan and people like him will pinpoint that we didn't take COVID seriously enough. When we took it, we were more strident in the restrictions on people's behavior than peer countries that had better results.
So I really want to, I think we should just be accurate about what Mehdi was arguing. Specifically, he was arguing that the learning loss has been overstated. He I think, made an argument about to the extent that there are psychological negatives from being in the home or not in school, that having been made an orphan or losing one of your parents because of COVID also has obviously deep psychological effects on a child, worse psychological effects than having to do school on Zoom or what have you. And my understanding was that he was making some cost-benefit analysis arguments about not denying the negative impact of some of the COVID interventions, but saying that some of what was avoided was worth the cost, and that people are doing different kinds of cost-benefit analyses. Even the guest that we had talking about the way that Sweden handled things so differently was very open to the idea that there are all kinds of factors at play, including the different fundamental baseline kind of health of Swedes as compared to Americans, not having as robust social safety net and healthcare systems to support people. He said that people could social distance more voluntarily in Sweden because they had more autonomy to do so, basically, perhaps more favorable labor standards and such. And so it wasn't an argument that we should do absolutely nothing, but the argument he was making was that people were able to do things voluntarily in Sweden that also helped to suppress the spread of COVID.
On the negative, on the learning loss front, look, I know some people, I guess, supporters of the mitigation efforts that were undertaken think the learning loss has been overstated. I am certainly open to the argument that it's overstated. People, there's some learning loss when kids get summer vacation, right?
Yeah.
Every year. There have been studies coming out that suggest a significant degree of learning loss. Of course, there are studies pointing everything in every direction. I think it's going to take more time to understand what the impacts of all this is. I do know. I've read about specifically the math and reading being behind. Maybe it'll catch up. Maybe it won't be as big a deal. But I'm more skeptical or just not understanding what Mehdi Hasan type people want differently on the COVID response front, on the requirements and restrictions, when it was clearly possible to have less hard government restrictions and still do better with COVID.
Yeah, it's interesting. Various states reopened schools at different times, and including a lot of blue states went ahead and reopened schools in the fall of
and some schools were open. I looked at the school in the D.C. area. The Catholic schools in Virginia were open much more than the public schools. And I've seen some analyses suggesting that they didn't have higher rates of severe disease and death among people affiliated with the school. So there are a lot of questions about whether the lockdown policy for schools and in general is correlated with.
The point is that there was no lockdown policy. Different states reopened schools at different times, and it wasn't so starkly correlated with the politics of the people in the state. A lot of blue states,
it's correlated with the politics of the people in charge of the schools.
In various states. So this is I'm really confused about. We're talking singularly about one policy. There wasn't one policy. Various municipalities and communities made decisions on their own. That's supposed to be the whole point of federalism. People made decisions. It looks like in retrospect, there may or may not have been the same benefits that people anticipated from those decisions, depending on how people run the data.
That's all we're saying, sure.
And so now, but the segment is about Donald Trump arguing that this is the interesting political question, whether or not he is benefited by highlighting this intervention when under him, he implemented and advocated for so many of these quote-unquote lockdown policies.
He has no credibility. He should not have any credibility on this issue.
I don't
with
remember
people who are
someone stealing my house keys and telling me I couldn't leave the house. It's not the same as the Chinese lockdowns. That's why I roll my eyes a little bit at that term. But let's call them stay-at-home school closure style policies.
Well, and our Swedish guest yesterday, Johan Norberg, please do check out that video if you missed it. It was really good. He brought up that Donald Trump early on in the pandemic shamed Sweden for its approach. Donald Trump was right there with Fauci and the rest of them in being for lockdowns and shaming dissenters. So again,
Exactly.
why
So what
would we
is-
give this guy another chance to do this?
And then why is he choosing to foreground this issue? This is something where arguably DeSantis, any number of other candidates, certainly someone like Vivek Ramaswamy has no record on this issue and can just say whatever he wants to say now because he wasn't in political office when any of this was going down. Why is he wanting to foreground this at this time? And also, when there are plenty of people, including people in blue districts, that had different policies to reopen earlier than other people in other parts of the country in red districts. One of the things that I really liked that the Swedish guest said was that part of the big problem here is that it's been so politicized. It's been so politicized. We can't have a conversation about what did and didn't work, how there are so many different factors involved when you're trying to make even assessments retrospectively about what is useful to us, that it's impossible. And now Donald Trump is doing more of the same, just arbitrarily picking a different side than he was on at the beginning of this pandemic. And what it's going to lead to is people making decisions based on politics as opposed to what's in the best public health interest. I think that's tragic and disastrous because yes, there is likely to be another pandemic in the history of humanity. And are we going to be able to actually deal with it? And what are we talking about here? Are we saying that it would have been a good idea to reopen schools prior to the distribution and invention of the vaccine?
I mean, again, that's what European nations were able to do that.
I think there were a lot of people who had good reason to be very concerned about that course of action, not because of the likelihood of the mortality of the child, but because of the child as a vector who would bring the disease back home to vulnerable people living at home, and also because of the vulnerability of teachers who were in that school environment. And one thing that Johan also pointed out was that in Sweden, people tend to live by themselves. We're able to self-isolate much more easily than a lot of communities in the United States with different cultural traditions of keeping older relatives in the home, having to live together because of our housing issues and economic precarity. And I know I spoke to people who had a lot of concern, not for themselves as a relatively young person, but for their elder loved ones. That's literally why I ultimately got vaccinated, because I was self-contained in my own apartment and was willing to play it out for a little bit longer because I could literally not be exposed to anybody. I podcasted from home. I didn't have to go anywhere. But when it came to visiting an older relative in Cleveland, well, then I made a different kind of decision. And I do think that has to be a part of this analysis. What are we actually advocating for here instead of just punching at clouds and saying we're mad at everybody else who in the thick of it might have made decisions that in retrospect didn't pan out the way we thought.
All right, we'll have more Rising right after this.